So it sounds like another important element of your rules on the committee, at least in the success of the legislation we're discussing, is that you forced them to work on it for a long period of time. So time also comes back into it, where you need a critical mass of time together in order to get the result.
Yeah. Well, it is. And these things, that's the hearing process and who you have common. And again, Ted Kennedy was a great teacher in all of this. He used to have a dinner at his home in January every year, and just the members of his committee, no spouses, no children, no staff, nothing else. And it would be a fun evening, a relaxing evening, and starting to create mood in a sense. We're about to start, particularly a new Congress. And he would start to his right, around that dining room table, or left, depending on where people are seated, to the ranking member if he was the chairman. And normally these dinners when he was the chair, but would turn to an Orrin Hatch or go to a Nancy Kassebaum or whoever was, Arnold, whoever was the ranking member in those days. But start there. What would you like to do these next 2 years? You know, what's your agenda? And he'd go to each person and ask their agendas. And he would make a point over the next 2 years, one way or another, to make sure that at least one, maybe two of those ambitions of those Republican members, that he would try and help get it done for them, one way or another, maybe not exactly what they wanted. And then he'd turn around, he had his agenda too, and the thing, and he'd have to compromise a bit on it. But it's awfully hard to turn down a guy who's wanted to make sure that you can get your things done to a large extent. It was a great lesson. I remember watching him do it, learning you don't get everything you want. I was at a meeting one time with Bob Dole. I passed the first child care legislation since World War II, the Act for Better Child Care. And Bob Dole was going to give me $5. I wanted 10, whatever the number was. I forgot now. And Ted Kennedy went with me, and I'm sitting in Dole's office and talking about it. And Dole was making the points that 10 was too much. I wasn't going to accept that number. And I'm kind of banging the table. I was new and the place relatively new. And Ted Kennedy goes to me and says, "Can we take a time out?" And I said, "Time out? What the hell's that about?" So I went out in the hall with him. He goes, "Listen, you're not going to get the 10. Bob Dole is offering you half of what we wanted to get. You take the 5. We'll come back next year and we'll get another 2 or 3 or 4. That's how this works." And I remember the moment was, yeah, that makes sense. And I've watched more people blow something up. And I asked him one time, "What was your biggest legislative mistake in your 42 years in that body?" So I can answer that question in 2 seconds. In 1969, Richard Nixon called me, new president, and said, "How would you like to do a health care bill, a universal health care bill?" And Kennedy said, "Let me see let me look at it." And the benefits were dreadful. They were terrible. And Kennedy said, "No, I'm not going to do that." He said, to this day, I think about it. We could have had a universal health care plan 50 years ago. And then you build on the benefits, or you argue about them. You add some, you may reduce some. He said, I learned then, you start with what you can. Every major piece of legislation that we talk about today began with a much smaller idea in many ways, and they grow. If they work, they grow. If they don't, they go away in a sense. And so that was, to me, being around people who've been through this themselves and on a personal level know how to make it work. Because they, after all, these are nothing more than just wearing different political labels and all the same problems. I remember I said the day I left, a Republican senator who'd just been elected came up to me on the floor of the Senate, who I know. And everyone's being sworn in, a lot of milling around on the floor of the Senate. And he came up and he kind of threw an elbow on my ribs and he said, "All right, what's your big advice? You're leaving, I'm just arriving." And I said, "Well, look over here on the Democratic side. Look at those wild-eyed liberals you're looking at over there. Let me give you some advice. You're a freshman in the minority. You're not going to have a hell of a lot to do in the first year or two around here, other than learn as much as you can about the place. I promise you the following. If you take each one of those wild liberal Democrats you're looking at out for breakfast, lunch, or dinner over the next year or so, 3 things will happen. One, I don't want to frighten you, but you're actually going to like each other. You'd be surprised. You probably followed very similar paths to get here. One a Republican, one a Democrat, the fights, the primaries, all the other garbage you had to put up with. Secondly, and this will really scare you, you're going to agree with each other on a lot more than you can imagine here. The things that we disagree about, everyone talks about. The things you agree about, no one talks about. And if you do the first 2, you will have the best time at this job imaginable. Then you're actually making a contribution and you've got relationships. And the way the place works, it's those relationships that produce results. It's not you talking to everyone who agrees with you on your side. It's finding some people on the other side who may agree with you. And you're only going to find out if they agree with you by getting to know them. If you don't get to know them, you're never going to find out unless by accident, in a sense, or maybe on a committee. And again, I can't say whether or not he did all of those things I suggested, but I believed it so strongly. That's how any institution functions. It's how you function in your own family, for God's sake, let alone the Senate or the House of Representatives.
So let's move on to the floor then. We've talked about committees. What rules do you think could improve the functioning of the Senate on the floor? And we could talk all day long about the filibuster, but maybe start with something else first and then ultimately head to that one.
Yeah, well, I would, things like, I think we ought to reduce tremendously the number of Senate confirmations of jobs. You could do a thorough vetting process and then you have the option of someone, because if they're going to go ahead with someone anyway, the obvious choice, someone had a criminal background, you don't want to just let that one go along. So there's some way to measure that instead of sending everybody up through this rate of people holding people up. I mean, I rarely, if ever, voted against any president's cabinet. Certainly, least of all, over policy divisions. You get elected, it ought to mean something, and you ought to be able to have your family, your official family, to function. That has become passé. I mean, one person can hold up a nominee on a committee, even that committee setting, they can hold it up. I mean, we didn't talk about that one, but that can happen. And I think we spent too much time on that garbage and the personality cults and so forth. So that'd be one thing I would do. I mentioned earlier about being in more often. I think that's important, and doing the people's business. I think it's reassuring to people know you're fighting. At least you're working on their behalf. And I don't think it helps us by just sending you home. Maybe good for you. I'm not sure it's good for the people you're talking to along the way. There are probably other these kind of dilatory rules and so forth. I mean, what I always try to make sure people understand is, look, Ben Franklin said to that woman, "We didn't give you a total democracy. We've given you a republic if you can keep it," and hence the bicameral system in a way, because they were wise enough and knowledgeable enough about how people can, if it was to be simple majorities, it can become, cause havoc in a sense with tyrannies of those. So the one, because it's the big one under discussion and debate, is the filibuster. I gave my farewell address, which if you're sleepless some night, you go on YouTube and you can watch it mapped. And the filibuster clearly needs to be reformed, what it is. But I say with the same degree of energy, it should not be abandoned. People say, well, it was not in the Constitution. No, it wasn't, but the Senate was. And the Senate was, in fact, the filibuster. As an institutionally, it was ingrained in the very creation of the institution. The founders didn't create two chambers in a unicameral system. They created very different systems in the system. And the Senate has evolved over the years from what they had in mind originally. But as it evolved and it became more of a populist institution, not unlike the House, with different rules, then the emergence of something like the filibuster, because that was the place where things are supposed to cool down. You're supposed to think twice about what you do. You got a 6-year term appointed by the state legislature. We're changing a lot of that, but we need to have something in its place to make sure that you're just not a reflection of what the House is. Why have it, for God's sakes? If you're going to end up with otherwise you end up with different results, and then what? Or you end up with the same result, and minority voices and others don't get heard in the process. So I believed it had value, but changes were made back around 50 years ago. One is we decided that you could conduct other business of the Senate while a filibuster was pending. Huge mistake to do that. I understood the thinking behind it at the time, and maybe people assumed it would still put pressure on the institution to resolve the matter. It did just the opposite. And secondly, they changed the language. It used to say that present in voting the membership, and now it's basically the Senate. So what happens is you still make it as difficult for the individual to conduct a filibuster. You got to do the same things you had to do 120 years ago: stand up and not move and not eat and any other bodily function for as long as you could withstand it. But after that, someone else could pick it up and continue going, and it was sort of well, it was an unspoken, unlegislated proposition. There's a filibuster going on. We're going to conduct other business in the meantime. And by the way, next Thursday at 5 p.m., we'll have a vote to invoke cloture. So everyone go do everything else you want to do. It's routine, and it should be extraordinary. You've got to feel that passionately about something that you're willing to stand there and abuse yourself for how many hours you can tolerate it. And you had to ask people who supported you to be prepared to sleep on cots, not go home, and not go on a vacation, or not go back to your state, because I'm going to need the other 39 of you here to support me when that cloture comes at any time. So, I went through a few of those sleepless nights on a cot in the marble room off the floor of the Senate. We don't have to do that anymore. Make the institution, its members, realize how serious this is, and you've got to be there. How many nights are you going to want to sleep on a cot? At what point do you maybe get to the point, let's resolve the matter or stop it? So until it becomes painful, as it was intended in a sense to be, and as long as it's routine, it's going to be used endlessly. Now, to Democrats, I said, you don't have to, everyone wants to bring up the civil rights debate. Forget the civil rights debate. Dirksen did that without the filibuster because Johnson did, because he got Dirksen to go along. He got others to do it. In fact, there were 6 floor leaders, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. My father was one of the 3 Democrats on the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act back in the 60s. In this time, he didn't need it. But I said, the Democrats, it was 36 months ago that one president filled 1/3 of the Supreme Court because all it takes is 50 votes here. And the reason we've had relatively moderate judges at the district, appellate, and Supreme Court level for the last 200 and some odd years is because you didn't nominate someone. If it was going to be, and those kind of things, it's a lifetime appointment. That gets pretty serious. You better send up someone that you could enjoy a pretty broad-based support, even if they don't agree with them, in a sense that this is a highly competent individual who's going to do their best to defend people's rights and the Constitution of the United States. All of a sudden, 50 votes will do it. And all of a sudden you get for Democrats, what more do you need to know? You ended up with 1/3 of the Supreme Court for the next 40 years. That was a great result for you, no filibuster. So reform it, don't abolish it, make it painful so that it becomes, once again, the extraordinary event. The reason it wasn't used much before 1975 wasn't because people were nice guys and they liked each other. It was because it was painful. That's why it wasn't used much. Sorry about that. I got a little wound up about the subject matter.
Well, it's an important one that is a central focus for so many, and a central focus of research.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that so much
Think
attention is
long,
brought
think
to it.
beyond just the immediate problem. And I don't disagree. Look, right now pending is this whole issue of voting rights, the HRI. It is a huge issue, and for me, it's a terribly important issue. It also is a reflection of what Democrats used to do, and we don't do anymore. It used to be that we worried about at the granular level in politics, that town clerk's job that was voted in, or the registrar of voters and so forth. And we all got preoccupied with the Congress and the Senate and the presidency. And it's a lot less costly to support financially races for the state legislature than it is congressional races. And we almost walked away from a lot of those races and worried about Congress when state legislatures draw the lines and the boundaries of these things and decide what the laws are going to be and elections until we change the law on that. So, I appreciate the importance of the issue, and it is true. It's going to pose some huge threats, in my view, because I think a lot of the proposed provisions are outrageous, what are being suggested. But the idea that we're going to be able to filibuster, you got to get 60 votes. You don't have 60 votes for this, in my view. Wish you did in some ways, but if you don't, so you're going to try and change the law, change the rules, because you've got to vote. There's always some bill that will preoccupy the attention of an individual Congress more than anything else that comes along. But we've had the wisdom over the years, by and large, not to abandon the rules of the place because we couldn't figure out how to solve the problem in front of us. So I worry that we're getting so caught up in the momentary appetites to satisfy one problem by abandoning a set of rules that have allowed us in a pluralistic democracy where we require our ability to come together as a people. And it's hard. I've never seen a single president, I've served with 7 of them, that ever got everything they wanted. You don't. And the worst word in American politics today is moderation. And yet that's what the system was designed to do as a pluralistic country, if you want to retain democracy.
So let's dig just a couple minutes into this concept of debate, dialogue,
Yeah.
however you want to call it. I mean, we touched about it a little bit in the, in the committee, where it sounds like a lot of it in your mind has to happen. And then there's something on the floor. I mean, where do you see really the things getting done? Is it the committee level? Is it the floor? Is it back rooms? Is it, that dining room table, Ted Kennedy's table, where, if we had to allocate time to one of those locations, for things to get done, where would we put it?
Well, you're dealing with human nature, Matt. I mean, it is structure. But personalities are absolutely critical. And so, and I'm not going to get into my views of leadership, but it really can set the tone on how things happen. And so it makes it difficult to be a leader if, in fact, you strip the leadership of its ability to lead. But then you're depending upon the qualities of the leader to be able to guide you through things. And I've always, I like to have people be strong leaders. I think that's the best way to get things done. I've seen all sorts of different ways, but my view has been that when someone was a good leader, the place generally functioned better because they set the tone, they set the mood, they speak in ways that reflect the party, what they care about, the caucuses or the conference you belong to. So I mentioned that some of the rules I think could be done away with to make the place work better. But I'm not in great favor of turning the power over to 435 House members, 434 of them, and leaving the speaker to have to function in an environment where everybody's got their own individual power, or small factions of them can. So I'm cautious about wanting to adopt a lot of rules that limit the ability of no matter how disappointed I may be about Mitch McConnell's leadership and the things he's done, and there are any number of examples, and I can cite that, and go around and adopt a rule, I suppose, if we get 67 votes, because that's how many votes it takes to change a Senate rule, to modify his behavior. So if you've got a year left on your term as president, you get to nominate a president. You don't get to guarantee they get confirmed, but you can do that. And in a sense, because certainly that was an outrageous abuse of power, in my view. And I'd like to shut down that from ever happening again. But, I've been around long enough to watch someone else will come up with some new creative idea, some different way. Water has a way of finding its way, in a sense, and those things do. So I think it's a combination of things. One is money. I mean, I will tell you this, and I know you say, well, that's typical Democratic chatter. It used to be you had to be a landowner that owned property and white male to vote. And we've abandoned all of those rules. But de facto, if not de jure, we're back at it again, basically. I mean, spending $25 million on a Senate race in a relatively small state is not uncommon today. I didn't spend anything like that in 5 Senate races combined today. And so you want that institution to become an available institution to a broad spectrum of our country, if possible, or at least not to limit the people who can even think about doing this in a way. And so, unless we get back to it, used to be the parties were basically the strong entities. Today, parties are almost non-existent to a large extent, and it's outside interest groups that really control the agenda more than a political party does, in a sense. And the one way you limit that to some degree is you limit the ability to basically finance these operations. You now have members up here, and I know they all complain about it every day, that have call time every day. That's part of the agenda. That's going home every week for 3 days or 4 days and spending an hour or two every day as a member of Congress on the phone raising money from the moment you're reelected or elected until the next election. And until something's done about that, we limit the people who can even think about doing this. And if they want to do it and they don't have the resources themselves, they have to commit to various organizations and groups that have very rigid agendas. And you're either for them or against them. And so you end up I was rewarded politically because I was good at putting things together, passed a lot of bills, several of them, many of them landmark pieces of legislation. Today, I would be penalized for doing that to a large extent. It's exactly the reverse in 10 years, what it was. And until we make it possible for people to come, I'm not suggesting eliminating raising money altogether. I don't think, I'm not looking for federally, subsidizing all of these things at all. But we got to do something about it. And so if I could fix any one thing, I'd like people to come at least with the mindset, I'm going to try and get things right and fix things. And if I fool around once you get there with the rules of the place to make it happen, it's not a bad idea. But if you really want to make a difference, figure out a different way that people can finance these operations without having to fall into either to have the personal fortune yourself to do it or the reliance on organizations and groups that will demand accountability for it. And I wish I had a more sophisticated answer for you, but my experience has been that's where a lot of it lies, right there.
So one of my questions is, what institutional improvement would you make within 50 years?
Well, I think that's one we just talked about. I mean, that's that I worry. The default position for democracy is not more democracy. As we see, less than 40% of the world's population live in something that could be called a free system, whether it's a socialistic system or a capitalistic system. The number is shrinking pretty rapidly. And what we're seeing and watching or worrying about here, you go to Poland, you go to Hungary, you go to Brazil, you go to the Philippines, you can get out in the world, not to mention the Russias and the Cubas and the Chinas and so forth. It's getting, and understandably, people gravitate to it. Civics, there's only one state in the union that has a high school graduation requirement that you have a year of civics, that you understand what your rights are, what the structures are. How do you love something you don't even have the basic understanding of? It used to be that was pretty routine. And most states do something, but only Colorado does the requirement. I don't know how rigid they are about it, but that's at least on paper. That's something I would get back to very quickly. We can't waste time over the next 50 years. That ought to be done immediately, in my view. And you can start in grade schools. You don't have to wait until high school or middle schools. I won't bore you with a great story with a grandmother who taught me that lesson in Connecticut. I said, well, how do you begin with elementary school children? She said, I'll show you. And she brought out her two grandchildren, 1 7, 1 8. And she said, children, I'm going to ask you a question. If you don't eat your peas at dinner tonight, and I send you to bed without your dinner, and I don't give you any breakfast in the morning or any lunch tomorrow, I'll require you to stay in your room. What is that? That's the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. These children knew the whole 10 amendments, but in the context of their own experiences. And so their point was, if you try to teach it as a PhD course, no, of course they're not. But if you relate it to their world, they can understand these concepts along the way. So I'm a great believer that we need to do more of this because of that simple question. So money, civics, we made a lot. I think we need to find ways to celebrate this more. That's more of individual choices. But what I told you about doing schools turned out to be, I think, a smart decision politically, and I think it is smart. But also, it's a great experience. I always tell businesses, what should we be doing? That congressman doesn't seem to understand what we do. God, they don't listen and blah, blah. I said, I can't predict what everyone is apt to do. But I tell you, if you invite the congressman to come to your business in your home state, one of those weeks he's home or she's home, and you say, we'd like you to come. We got about 50 employees here. Want you to meet them. We don't want a speech. We'd like you, if you could, for maybe 45 minutes now, if you just listen to what we do. We'd like you to leave and say, well, now I know what that XYZ plant does for a living. You'll be amazed at the response you'll get, how willing people are anxious. They rarely get invited to do that, to go on that floor at 9 o'clock in the morning and listen to guys with a cup of coffee in their hand talk about what they do for a living. You'll appreciate the hard work. You'll appreciate the creativity. They'll appreciate the fact that you've come to listen to them, even if they don't agree with you or you agree with them. I would do more of that. I'm not sure people do those things. They don't extend the invitations. So the people that members of Congress listen to are the people who invite them. If you invite the Congress, you have a better chance they're going to listen to you. In a campaign, you talk to everybody because you want their votes. Once you get elected, you respond to the invitations that come in. And so the people who invite you become the ones that get you, in a sense. And so if you don't broaden that agenda, and both the members should do that, but it's always easier to accept an invitation than to try and get one. So the more people invite people to come to the school, come to the business, whatever it may be, you increase, then that trip home I'm less hostile about because you're setting the agenda to a large extent, not they are. And you start to develop those relationships. And I mean, those don't require, a PhD in political science to figure out. Those are 2 or 3 things, Matt, I kind of suggest. So a lot of it is at that, the root, before it gets to the institution. The tendency is to focus on how can we make the institution function better. It's such a human institution that getting the humans to come to the institution with a commitment to make it work, I think is, if you could choose one way or the other to figure it out, I'd have a lot more faith that ultimately we might get something out of that process. And it's much more opaque than specific rules changes. But I think in the long term, it's really what I think we'd like to think how this institutions function. But if we send them to town and all they've heard is the nastiness, the bitterness, vote this way or don't even talk to those people, and they arrive in town, you're pretty much, the game's over before it even begins.
Right. Well, to understand that, and it's echoed by a lot of others who have talked on the program about the ways to think about the long term. It's developing the relationships, it's understanding the constituency, not just the ones who have voted in the primary, but the whole.
John Warner was a great friend of mine from Virginia, and many years ago, he was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and former Secretary of the Navy, represented Newport News in Virginia, major shipbuilder, including many submarines. I represented Groton, Connecticut for 36 years as a congressman, as a senator. And we did one thing, we made submarines and had been making them for years. And the issue came up on which company would get the contract for the largest submarine ever built at the time, the Seawolf submarine. But needless to say, I'm not on the Armed Services Committee, I'm in the minority. I'm not on a committee even. And this is a battle between myself and the guy who's the chair of that Armed Services Committee. Needless to say, we did a lot of work to try and win. I'll never forget, I always believed you had to show up when you might win or you might lose, to be there, not just showing up when you win. I'm in the car driving down to Groton. We're going to get the news that afternoon who won. Halfway down in the car, I get a call. Groton, Connecticut won the contract. God, incredible. Down there, 28,000 people. I was the hero of the hour, having fought for them and so forth. I get back to Washington that night, and I'm at my apartment, and I'm walking down the hall of my apartment building, and I can see it. It's late. It's about midnight, and I can see there's a package leaning against my door as they go into the apartment. And I pick it up and open it up, and there is a first edition jacketed copy of Jack London's The Seawolf, a great bottle of red wine, and a note. You did a hell of a job. Your friend, John Warner. Now, it sounds quaint today, but that's the way that's happened all the time on things. It was a rough battle. We both fought hard in the sense, but that was yesterday. This is today. No one's a permanent enemy. This isn't a fraternity you've joined, or a social club. Your job is to try and make things happen for people, and you do the best you can, and you don't destroy relationships over a vote or a position on something. And so I often tell students that story to get the idea. It wasn't that long ago, and they tell me, the members now that I know tell me actually they get along better than you'd think. But obviously, no one ever reports about planes that fly, and so the fact that there are problems we know about, but they actually do get along better than some things. So I find that encouraging when I hear that.
So last question is really just about your plans. Obviously, you've got a lot of energy and ideas still. for what the U.S. should do.
Well, I'm meeting
Congress, et
today after I
cetera?
finish with you on this interview, Matt. We got a guy, I do a lot of work with it's called what is it called? The Bipartisan Caucus. It's a group in town that Tom Daschle and Trent Lott sort of started some years ago. And I've done work with them. They've called me and asked me again to help out. I work a lot with Jack Danforth, the Republican, Chuck Hagel, myself, and Paul Kirk, who replaced Ted Kennedy in the Senate, was the former DNC chair. And the four of us have done a lot of work. We've written letters, done different things, rounded up 75 former members, Democrats and Republicans, calling for we'll help out on rules changes and ideas they may have. No one's taken us up on the offers yet. And I suspect we may end up sounding like, I walked barefoot to school in the snow, when I was a boy. And so we got to be careful about the egos and trying to, but we've at least thought offering to help and knowing that there's a lot of us out there that care about this stuff. So after this afternoon, we got a group of us meeting to talk about the filibuster. And can we come up with some ideas that make some sense, that would reform it, not completely get rid of it. If you were in the place long enough, you began to understand the value of it at critical moments. And so there is a value to it. As I say, the Senate was a filibuster as envisioned 240 years ago. But obviously, as it became more democratized as an institution, then there had to be something to replace the structural nature of the Senate that was a filibuster in effect, or at least had the opportunity to do so. So I think trying to get the institution to understand that and figure out ways in which it could become a viable option, but only on extraordinary circumstances, where extraordinary people are willing to make extraordinary efforts to make a point that they care about on a bill or something else.
Well, Senator Dodd, thank you so much for your service. And it was great talking to you today. Appreciate your insights, and good luck with the coming years.
Well, thank you. And good luck to you. Good luck with your program.